Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar, International Corporate Reorganizations, Challenges and Lessons Learned, presented in partnership between the Legal 500 and Evershed Sutherland. My name is Alan Cohen. I'm a research editor at the Legal 500. And before I hand over the webinar to our panelists, I will give a brief introduction of the topic. And first, I'm going to start with a little intro slide. So let me share my screen very quickly. All right, you should see it now. So at some point in their development, in their life, many businesses contemplate a solvent business reorganization as part of their drive to create synergies, deliver efficiencies, and just simply increase profits. Many different factors determine why, when, and how to implement such a corporate reorganization and where they will ultimately be a success or not. Reorganizations are carried out for different reasons, driven by different objectives, and are always influenced by a variety of circumstances. In this field, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, though. And so the very first step when defining how to reshape your business should be to identify your underlying drivers, determine your business objectives, and what eventually would work for your company, your stakeholders, and your business culture. Indeed, the reorganization can sometimes, as you know, be burdensome to all of your stakeholders, whether they are investors, employees, customers, or any other third parties, really, if you're not prepared and do not coordinate your actions. And so today we're bringing together a panel of speakers with expertise in both corporate and tax to discuss multinational corporate reorganizations. The speakers will explore the various elements that make up these transactions, from planning to due diligence and from key project deliverables to post-completion matters. They will also consider challenges and opportunities and will take a look forward to lessons we can learn for deals in 2023 with views from the UK, Europe, and the US. So I'll hand over to them in a moment, but I'd like to let our audience know that this session is interactive. So if you have questions at any point during the webinar, please submit them using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will put them to the panelists after the discussion is over. Okay, then I'm handing this over. Dave Serna, we've got two Davids today. Dave Serna, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I'll ask maybe David Pinkney to do the same, and then Edda and Randy, the Evershed Sutherland partners who are leading the conversation today. Dave, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks very much, Alan. Yeah, hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you are. My name is Dave Serna, and I am Senior Counsel at Jazz Worldwide. It's an international global freight forwarder headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. And I'm happy to be here.
David, I think.
Yes, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I should have maybe perhaps stayed on like that. David, do you want to carry on?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alan. And I'm delighted to be here today. So thank you, Eversheds, and thank you, Legal 500. My name is David Pinkney. I've been at Nippon Telegraph and Telecom, aka NTT, little known in probably the Western world, but extremely well known in Asia's Pacific region, formerly as Japan Telecom, if you want the literal translation. I'm the General Counsel for the European region. Originally, I started in their European sort of micro company called Entity Communications. I now have a team of about 30 lawyers across 15 European countries as a result of a merger that we did about 3 years ago with another big corporate called Dimension Data of South African naissance. I also have a very small EU risk and compliance team comprising of data privacy, risk, audit, and ISO. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Edda, I think this is your turn.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go first, Alan.
Yes,
Randy Buchanan. I'm an international tax partner at Evershed Sutherland in the United States. I've been with the legacy Sutherland firm my entire career, and then we joined with Evershed to form the global organization we're part of today, which I'm very proud of. And lots of experience doing various reorganizations and carve-outs and similar types of transactions, and looking forward to talking about some practical insights. I'm the tax person, so I'll be providing a tax perspective today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then this time, Edda, please go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Edda Demirel. I'm a corporate partner based in London. I lead the international corporate reorganization practice at Evershed Sutherland. I'm a German qualified lawyer, qualified to practice also in the state of New York and England and Wales. I'm very, very happy to have our excellent panel speakers, David and Dave. We decided that we will distinguish the two Davids by using the Dave abbreviation for Dave Cerna, and David Pinkney remains David. Anyway, I'd like to pose my first question to Dave. Dave, you are actually a commercial litigator by background, but yet have been involved in leading one of the largest reorganizations in this decade, which was the preparation of the split up of one of the few remaining truly global US conglomerates and household brands, GE. I actually also worked on parts of it. You were at GE Power. I worked on the biopharma carve out. And there was a lot going on during, I think, 2018 and 2020. A lot of the non-core businesses were carved out and sold. And since then, GE actually has announced its split into three separate businesses, as we know it, the aviation, healthcare, and energy. And I'd like to focus on that a little bit because it's a truly iconic reorganization. And it's quite interesting because you're not a corporate lawyer. I just mentioned you're a commercial litigator by background. And I think it's quite unique, maybe, or not, to find yourself in a position where you were leading a corporate reorganization. So tell us, please, how did you get this role, and well, how did it feel to be responsible for such a important and significant project?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. That's right. So yes, you're absolutely right. My background prior to going in-house was as a commercial litigator for a little over a decade at a law firm here also in Atlanta. And then after that, I got a position at GE Power, but again, still doing commercial work, doing commercial negotiations for service contracts for GE Power heavy duty gas and steam turbines for power plants and large infrastructure projects. And then if I get my dates right here, I want to say 2014, we announced the acquisition of the steam and turbine and energy business of Alstom, which is a French multinational company. That took approximately, I think, 2 years to go through all the regulatory approvals and to closure. So I think we closed in about 2016. Again, if my dates, if my memory serves correct. And after that acquisition, it was I think about a $12 billion acquisition. There was a lot of integration work to be done because we overlapped in many footprints and the businesses were overlapping in some areas as well. And I went sort of from a commercial negotiator to doing some of the integration work. And really, I kind of got to working on the corporate reorganization and restructuring part by really sort of not saying no to any project that my boss, my general counsel at the time, brought to me. And so as I sat in the business in GE Power, I ended up leading sort of the commercial stream of the corporate restructuring to integrate the post-acquisition Alstom and GE Power. And it was, I was out of my element, much as I am presently on this call, or this panel, again, with sort of a commercial litigation background. Corporate restructurings and corporate activities were not sort of my specialty. So it was pretty daunting. And it really, you know, kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things, because it really sort of touched on every aspect of the business. Alan's slide that he put up at the beginning of the talk, it really does touch on each and every one of those areas that was sort of on the outside ring of the slide there. And so it was an eye-opening experience for me.
And I guess what people always think when they haven't been involved is, oh, it's so easy, look at the steps, and I can do it myself. So actually have been hearing this a lot recently. I don't know why, but it's whenever you, I mean, if you're truly involved and have been through such a project, everybody knows it's so complicated. It gets more complicated with the more jurisdictions are involved and the more expertise is required. And yeah, so if you reflect back now, I mean, it's been fast forward 2023. We both are working on an integration now that you're Jazz. You're going to become the GC actually now of Jazz. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And if you think back and now, what do you wish you had known prior to taking the project, the first project at GE, and to ensure a smoother delivery and success of the project? Maybe you did everything right. I mean, that's possible too, of course. But
yeah, I wish I could say we did everything right. Yeah, I mean, I think really sort of the what I wish I had known at the time that I was sort of put into that role was really all of the various moving parts, kind of like what you just described, Etta, in that, you know, it does, as mentioned, it does touch on every function within the business. And a lot of it is driven by, in my experience, tax and the operations team, sort of in terms of a lot of things of what drives a reorganization, and also the timing for the reorganization, because a lot of times, you know, the business has to be ready to be able to make and implement those changes. So there's a lot of lead time in getting, you know, across the finish line. And honestly, you know, I really wish I had more corporate knowledge at the time. Obviously, I have done it a few additional times here at Jazz. We did 4 acquisitions in 2021 alone. And so over the last 18 months or so, we've done actually 2 additional corporate restructurings and integrations of those acquisitions. And I knew much more this time going into it. But even still, you know, we relied a lot on law firms for assistance, although in an effort to you know, save on some legal fees and professional fees, we did do a lot of the project management internally, which has its positives and negatives. And it at some point, and the last one I did at the end of the year of 2022 was in 10 jurisdictions, from APAC to EMEA in Europe. It became all time consuming. I mean, that's probably all I worked on for the last 2 months of the year to get everything across the finish line by the end of the year. And it took up large portions of my day in talking with the legal teams, talking with the tax teams, talking with our operations teams and our IT teams to make sure that everything was ready and prepared to go on December 31st is when we were implementing all of our changes. And so and the labor and employment teams and our HR team. So it really does touch on every facet of a business. And, you know, I would find it really fascinating, but it's not flashy. I'll say that. You know, you have sort of the corporate merger and acquisition, the M&A work. That's what everybody thinks is really sort of the big deals and where it's at. But you know, the nuts and the bolts of the after, I think, is really, really interesting, and it does really require a dedicated cross-functional team, including professional advisors, you know, tax advisors and legal advisors, to actually make the merger and the acquisition or spin-off, as it may be, work. So
project management is key, basically, right? And
absolutely.
Yeah, but I think the other thing, though, Dave, you're saying that's been my experience as well, is it gets you into the operational side of the business. And the M&A stuff is really sexy, and that's what gets the headlines. But you know, the restructuring, as you're saying, helps the business actually operate and deliver whatever goods and services it's trying to provide to its customers. And that's the part I find really interesting about it is, and you know, I would say, I would like to reiterate what you said about tax, that almost everything you do has tax implications. And, you know, I think whether it's your internal tax team or an external tax advisor, the more visibility they have into the operational aspects and what are you really trying to accomplish? You know, in my experience, it's easier to help you figure out the best path to do that from a tax perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably the biggest lesson I learned when I was at GE Power was, and when I came over to Jazz and learned we were doing all these acquisitions, was really make friends with your internal tax team if you have one, and if you don't, you know, make friends with your external tax advisors, because tax really does sort of drive a lot of what happens in a corporate restructuring and reorganization. And the tax teams, you know, sometimes they can get pretty creative. And you're right, Randy, you do have to then go to the business team and say, hey, is this something that we can do or that we can make work? So it's a highly collaborative effort. And now more and more also having IT involved and having your ERP, you know, able to do exactly what you're saying, Randy, to deliver on that tax strategy. It really is critical. So the first thing I did when I came to Jazz was I identified our global tax director and took her to lunch, and you know, we became fast friends, and I to this day have a standing weekly meeting with her and her team to implement these things, because it really is critical.
That's actually a really good point. And also my next question is actually, you've worked with external service providers, both at your previous role at GE Power as well as Jazz. Obviously, we're working together, and you know, there's all these different service offerings, and we agree that tax is essential in putting together the new business structure. Do you think it's more efficient and it's a benefit to have a provider that provides both tax and legal? I mean, I know at GE you had a very strong tax department, but you still had some input from the outside. And what is your so far experience? I mean, have you had a service provider where you received both inputs? And it's interesting to know, actually.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, when I was at GE, as you may know, it was such a global conglomerate that we almost had sort of our own. I like to think of it as our own in-house law firm. And then also, you know, we did have a very, very strong tax team, which we actually spun out the tax team to PwC, I think was who we ended up working with thereafter. And so in both situations, when I was at GE Power and also here at Jazz, I had different tax and legal advisors. And being that I was doing my engagements from the US and a US based corporations both times, it's not as easy, I'll say, I guess, to have, if you were to work with one of the big four and they offer both legal and tax, they don't like to do those engagements for US corporations because we have different sort of strictures on CPAs and tax firms here. And I will say, I mean, I could definitely see some benefits in having your tax and legal advisors, you know, be the same. Because I will say the integrations that I just did at the end of 2022, I would get, you know, legal advice from Eversheds, and then I would have to then go to our accounting and tax advisors. And so there was a lot of ping ponging back and forth between them, and in several countries we just put them all together to have the conversations directly. So I think there would definitely be value in having, you know, consolidated tax and legal advice in one place. So yeah, it definitely would have value to that.
See, Randy, that's why we do it together.
Yeah, no, well, that's right. And I guess a follow-up question to that, Dave, you know, what's your perspective? I mean, to the extent you had, and these are not leading questions, we really want to know what you think, even though we're at a law firm. But you know, what's your perspective on, I mean, one of the potential advantages of having people at the same firm work on something is they can talk to each other without you having to be in the loop. But I guess how comfortable or uncomfortable are you with the idea that tax and legal and HR and other folks may be talking to each other without you being part of every conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, I mean, candidly, it does make me a little bit nervous to have, you know, all of the lawyers talking to each other without us being involved quite as much. And you know, I mean, developing that tax strategy together with sort of the corporate strategy, you know, I mean, it does take a lot of collaboration. So it could definitely have value, but I would want to be sort of part of those conversations, I think, because yeah, again, I mean, the tax people can get pretty creative a lot of times, and there's sometimes when, as somebody in the business, you sort of just need to say, no, that won't work for, you know, XYZ reasons or things like that. So yeah, I think you do have to put some constraints on the teams to make sure to get it done. But I mean, it definitely, I mean, when we were working with this last integration, Eversheds did offer us, and we did utilize tax advice in a couple of countries, and it was extraordinarily convenient, particularly on stamp duty filings and tax issues as well, because those issues intersect so, you know, tightly with the corporate issues and the restructurings and things like that, that it was very helpful to have that all in one place.
I think, David, I give you a little bit of break and address some of our burning questions to David. David, you mentioned you've been with NTT for some time, I think 9 years. You are the Group GC for the European region. It's a great role and definitely a demanding role. During this time, you also mentioned that you have been involved in one of the largest corporate restructurings at NTT, when NTT was consolidating its different brands under one umbrella and merging recently NTT Communications with the South African giant Dimension Data, and shortly it will actually merge further with NTT Data Inc. Sometimes actually mix up all the names with, but to form really a global ICT company. I believe it's in excess of $18 billion revenue and 140,000 employees. So quite impressive. And we briefly touched on the post-acquisition integration from Dave's perspective, and we know that acquiring a new company is just the first step. And whilst all the M&A lawyers get the awards, we corporate reorganization specialists come in later to basically help to build one firm and to help, in all seriousness, create the synergies that hopefully the business was looking for. And that can be quite difficult, especially when it's both global companies with a global footprint, employees all everywhere, different cultures, trading relationships, operations, IT, you name it. I mean, there's so many areas. And it will be even more difficult when there are so many components, as I said, for example, the geographical footprint. At NTT, I remember when I was involved in the first phase, I think it was over 80 countries. The three main businesses, NTT communications and dimension data, and what was the third one? I have to look even now at NTT security, and then the so-called 25 M&A affiliates. So that was exactly a project of my liking. Lots of countries, lots of different businesses. The first thing that comes to my mind, and really like to hear from you, being one of the key stakeholders. NTT is a Japan-based company, and Dimension Data was South African. So very different cultures, not only, I mean, yes, just yeah. So how did the business ensure to have a smooth integration, and were there difficulties? I mean, of course there were difficulties, but yeah, just to learn. I think that's fascinating actually to hear from your side.
No, absolutely. First of all, though, because I'm highly competitive, I was quite disappointed that Dave's company was told that his is the biggest corporate restructuring in the last decade, whereas of course I always thought it was mine. But,
no, we focused actually on the split up of GE. So the reason also was one was more on the carve out, the spin-off side, and you on the post-acquisition side. Dave went off script and talked about the integration. That's another point. But so no. Definitely both really large corporate reorganizations happening.
Absolutely. To your point though, yes, you probably couldn't have two polar opposites. Japanese culture, South African culture. I have to be very careful with my words, of course, because Eversheds themselves have got a very big South African contingent who we use actually. Dimension Data, my colleagues, still quite a few in South Africa. There are less Japanese in the Central European function, but we do have to be very culturally aware. The Japanese, by their nature and history, are very, very conservative. They respect hierarchy. In fact, they have a mnemonic called Hon Ren So, which actually stands for, I'm going to offend some people now, Hukoko, Renrako, and Sudan, which actually means report, contact, and consult. And that's very much how they transact in daily life. An employee will always look to their boss. The boss will look to the next boss. It's very difficult and sometimes frustrating to get a decision out of a single person. The flip side is, of course, our South Africans, who are very much more, shall we say, direct and slightly more forceful. And of course, you therefore get this slight clash. The conservative person is going, oh, I'm a rabbit in headlights, and potentially could be bamboozled by a slightly more brash South African person. So we have to overcome that. And of course, Dimension Data as well started life very much as a small private firm, and it just grew exponentially into this big global company. But many of the executives did have an entrepreneurial flair, sometimes didn't abide by the rules. So again, that's in complete contrast to the Japanese, where they absolutely diligently follow the rules. So back to your point, I think how we managed to bring that together is that we did appoint a very strong program director from the outset. And we set out a very strict timetable. And by doing that, we were able to say, look, we're all going in the same direction because we all want the same outcome. And the sort of Central European team, myself included, were predominantly UK and Europeans. So actually our job was just to navigate the different ways and the different approaches. My experience in the prior 6 years with the Japanese piece of the business meant that I understood how a decision could be obtained as quickly as possible, rather than having to wait. Indeed, actually, Japanese have a word called nemawashi, which is a meeting before a meeting. If you need to get a decision, actually, you've got to go and whisper in someone's ear, who will whisper in someone's ear, so that the right person will come to the meeting equipped and will say, oh, we think this is a very good idea, blah, blah, blah. And you think, great. So actually, that was my idea, but it's gone round the circle. But likewise, it's about saving face. I certainly couldn't go to a Japanese elder superior and say, oh, don't do this or don't do that, because that could be seen as offensive. So I think to your point originally, it is about that cultural awareness and knowing which buttons to press and how to get the best out of people. I didn't do it in this company, but in a previous company, there is some merit in using an external, like a facilitator. I had a very large project previously, again, with two very distinct different factions. So we went to an offsite and we went through some of the sort of classic HRE type things about understanding different character traits and how we were going to work closely together. So I think that's a tip that you could perhaps do if you think there's going to be genuine confrontation, particularly if you're merging two who might have been competitors together into an organization.
That's interesting, really interesting. So as a GC, you are obviously one of the key stakeholders, but you're not the only one in your organization. And there are lots of functions. We already mentioned it a few times. Finance, treasury, HR, operations, you name it. And there's so many work streams and potentially frictions, I mean, within the same organization. And I guess we've seen it from the outset, but where functions not fight over the budget, but basically there is a certain, priority hacking order and how do you ensure, or in your function and in your position, that you, in the end, you all work towards the same goal? Because we from the outside we only do what we're told, of course. So
yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned a few moments ago we had so many different brands. We had Arcadin, Integralis, Capsidae, Atlas. There were different brands coming out of our ears. And to that point, the CEO actually did come up with a strapline, which is one NTT. So when we hear people going off about how they used to do this or they used to do that, or in our world, actually, we had people were described as green or blue because they were assigned to either their old logo, Dimension Data was green, or blue was NTT Communications. And even to this day, you still hear people talking about that. So we rein them back and say, no, we are one entity. We've got a common goal. And as I was just saying a moment ago, I think that the way that we could try and ensure that there was no squabbling, so to speak, was to appoint a really senior program director. And his whole role was to make sure that the project met the timetables. And in fact, he was senior, and then there were other multiple project managers for each of the jurisdictions because we were doing 6 at the same time. And I know Dave said that he was doing 4 or so, and most M&A lawyers, it's bad enough doing 1 or 2 at the same time, let alone 6 in 6 different jurisdictions. But by having the program director and then appointing a functional sort of head, as you mentioned, you've got your IT, HR, systems, legal, facilities management, whatever. Each of those had to do a particular function and they had to feed up into this overall project timetable. So I think that was the main thing to keep everyone on the straight and narrow.
I will say I will say, David, that I had a not so good experience on that one time. I was working on a Latin American restructuring project, an integration project, and the name of the project was Project Uno, right? And they picked Uno because the idea was one company within 1 year, right? It took us 3 years to do Project Uno. We got it done, but it you know, we all, like some of the other things we talk about, like IT and a lot of other things, you know, slowed things down, but so you got to stay on top of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I mean, when we talked about it actually before, you know, what's the difference when we were thinking about the topics and we're saying, oh, carve-outs versus integrations, and somehow you always think with carve-outs, you know, that there will be some consequences on the employment side, and somehow integration always sounds very positive. But in the end, unfortunately, there are also a lot of times circumstances where there is a reduction in force in employment for labor force, and also reduction in entity numbers. But so I assume you are quite often in a tough spot, and of course, David, you as well. But so it goes to both of you. How do you cope with the emotional stress that comes with it? I don't think it gives anyone pleasure to deal with the other side of the integration, let's put it this way. And it always reminds me of that movie with what was it, George Clooney, Up in the Air, where he took a suitcase and went one company to the other, and was actually trying to be still quite sympathetic, and then his junior basically thought it wasn't efficient enough. So anyway, so that always comes to my mind. So to both of you, actually, how do you cope with it?
Yeah,
what's your
it is always very sad, and you're right. In most of the communications, they never put the R word, redundancy, in any comms. It's always focusing on the positive. I was going to say a flippant remark. If you ask my wife, she'd say, well, I've got no emotional intelligence anyway, so it's just water off a duck's back. But joking aside, the business is very, very cognizant of its employees. They've actually got, even since I've been there, a lot more sympathetic. And now it's the employee comes first, and then perhaps your customers, and then your suppliers. And with that in mind, the managers, the line managers, and the HR teams do their utmost to actually treat the employees with utmost respect. Some of these people may well have been with us for quite some time. Our restructurings, as you alluded to earlier, was very much the merger of two big companies, the Dimension Data brand and the Entity Comms brand. So there was always going to be some overlap. It's not necessarily the primary driver, as we touched upon, but there will always be some casualties. So it's treating them with respect. Even, I mean, most of our restructurings close at the end of our financial year, 31st of March. Now, when you've got workers' councils, employee consultations and things, ideally we should be starting pre-Christmas. But we were mindful that it's not exactly the best thing to start a consultation just before Christmas. So actually we shifted around some of our timetable, and we would announce the news early in the new year, provided we could still then stick to our timetable, which in almost all cases we were able to. And similarly on other projects, we've always been mindful of religious festivals and holidays and things like that. So I think the bottom line is we're just mindful of that, and we're respectful to our people. And also, because of the countries we operate in, there's often quite a few workers' councils involved. And actually, although I was going to say they're a complete hindrance, and one of the big red flags for people listening to this call is to make sure you consult with the workers' councils as early as possible and be very transparent, or as far as you can be. They can play a good part in this, because they will already be speaking to their members and say, hey, this is what's coming up. We're going to negotiate on your behalf and do what we can. So it means that when you eventually get to the one-to-one with the individual employees, that boil has already been lanced to a degree. Tempers may have flared, but they probably come down by the time you speak to them. So sometimes that actually is quite useful, having that dialogue with the workers' councils as well.
I think that's a great tip. I mean, communications is really key. We
Yeah.
all agree to that.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess, David, you know, how can external advisors help people navigate all that, if at all? I mean, maybe that's just something that is better handled in-house, but.
They can, absolutely. That piece about workers' councils, if you're working closely with your external advisors regularly, as we often are, they actually get to know, you know, sort of first name terms, the heads of the workers' councils, and that is invaluable. So if you're in Germany or you're Netherlands or France or Spain, and you can go to a trusted advisor and they say, hey, don't worry, leave it with us. We're going to go straight to so-and-so and we'll pick it up. It's what I call more the pragmatic piece of the legal advice and the relationship that the external advisors built up, as opposed to just pure theory and just says, oh, this is the consultation period, this is what you need to do, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's invaluable. And actually that linked back slightly to what you said earlier about the having the tax team working hand in hand with the legal team. Sometimes that doesn't work because you are forced to use that same firm throughout, whereas actually your normal firm might have got the relationships that I was just talking about. So sometimes you need that local expertise. And so that's where it sometimes doesn't work. So there's pros and cons on that.
If I could jump in and add on that too, for any of the Americans that are on the calls, are on the call as well, you know, the workers' councils and TUPE, the transferring of undertaking in Europe, it's completely foreign to anything that we have here in the US. That was partially, or actually one of the driving factors in my last two integrations with Jazz here, was to get labor and employment counsel from Eversheds in the countries in which we had employees where we were having, you know, potential redundancies and overlap of positions and things like that. And it was critical to have them, like you said, David, you know, get to know the works councils early, have them involved. That to us was invaluable. Back when I was at GE, we were dealing with a very large French works council. And to your point, David, it was somewhat of a hindrance. The dates got pushed multiple times because of that, but also because of sort of the shifting and fluidity of the corporate restructuring itself as to what was going on and when and how things were going to, you know, turn out in the outcome. That added several delays to our integration with GE Power. You know, I think honestly it was almost 2 years, if I recall correctly. And so, you know, labor and employment, again, I agree, is one of the key areas where external counsel can really, really add a lot of value, because especially for the US practitioners, because we don't have anything like TUPE or works councils whatsoever. And so it's an absolute necessity to deal with to have outside counsel on that.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, Randy, I'll just jump in quickly and then. I mean, we already said it's reorgs, especially when they're multinational, are quite complex, and the resources, the in-house resources, are limited. I mean, you have your day jobs, and then on top of it, you're expected to project manage. I haven't come across many times this, but I think maybe in the future I will hear it more often. But there are sometimes clients who say we can deal ourselves, we're just going to project manage it. And Dave, you also briefly touched upon it, and it usually ends in a car crash. Not that I'm saying, but it does. I think you all agree. It's like also the awareness of different legal concepts. Yes, there is a distinction between common and civil law, but then there's also distinction between civil law countries, severe distinctions, the way you execute documents, the lead times. And then that's also why a detailed legal step plan is crucial for success, a long pole analysis, in identifying all the long lead times, the things we can do, and sometimes tell our lovely tax partners or colleagues, actually, what you're planning, we can't do because so and so. So anyway,
Exactly.
sorry, I just hijacked this.
Yeah,
But-
no. Well, and look, let's talk about that a little bit. You know, I think some tax folks think tax is the center of the universe, right? And you know, and as a tax person, I'm here to say that's not true. And you know, it goes back to something you said, David, in the Works Council context of looking for pragmatic advice. You know, I would encourage people to try to find tax advisors that take a pragmatic approach to these types of projects, because you can't. We have a saying here at the firm: there's no such thing as a perfect structure, right? And it's not all about tax. It's about helping the business accomplish what they're trying to accomplish operationally in as tax efficient a manner as you can within all the constraints you have to work within. You know, and I think that's one of the reasons Ed and I and others at the firm try to work together, is to try to bring that sort of holistic, pragmatic approach, as opposed to let me go in a back room and come up with a perfect tax structure that has no application in the real world. So you know, that's sort of my message from the tax side of this, is try to find those advisors, because you all can comment, but you know, I think that's more what you and the business people you work with are looking for in today's world.
Yeah, we had a recent example of that actually, where everything was tax driven. Some lovely papers were written saying this is what you should do. Typical things on the table: legal merger, which is available as an option in Central Europe, not UK, or a simple share acquisition, or business and asset transfer. And in this particular instance, they said, yeah, legal merger or shares. We can use all of the tax losses, carry forward, etc., all the sexy sort of stuff. But actually, they hadn't done what you just said. They hadn't actually really talked to the businesses that were merging together, and the one which was effectively taking on the other party said, do you know what, we don't want all of that. And there was a lot of legacy stuff that they didn't want. It ended up at a bun fight, and ultimately the whole thing then pivoted and it became just a business and asset transaction. So yeah, they do need to be pragmatic, and people do need to listen to the business needs and not just the theoretical tax paper that says this would be a good idea for the following reasons. So you're right.
And if I could add, I think that's where it's very helpful to have your tax advisors and legal advisors talking not only to each other, but like David said, to the business, to make sure that that's actually an outcome that is desired. But yeah, definitely having your tax advisors talking with your legal counsel to see, you know, if it is feasible, and again, bringing in sort of the labor and employment aspect as well. Integrations do affect people, you know, on a human level. And so again, the perfect tax structure, Randy, you said there is no such thing, and I agree, because oftentimes the perfect tax structure can detrimentally or negatively impact the employees to such a point that, you know, it's a perfect tax structure, but it's a terrible business structure. So yeah, it does help to have those conversations together.
Yeah, another saying we have here at the firm is, tell me the deal and I'll tell you the structure, right? Don't come ask me for a structure. Tell me what the deal is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess we're following on that. I mean, sort of in light of all that, sort of what are there other things we haven't talked about yet that are sort of hallmarks of what you think good client service looks like in this space?
Yeah, I can jump in on something, and Etta mentioned it, and this proved invaluable to me in the reorganization I just went through at the end of 2022. But having a step plan that does lay out, you know, everything that needs to be done, a timeline, what needs to be signed by whom, what needs to get filed, and all of those things was absolutely invaluable to us in our last restructuring. And we didn't do that the first time we did it in 2021, which was a little bit of a different circumstance, but we were given the task to do an integration in 90 days after closing. And so it was, everybody's hair was on fire, and there was no project management really whatsoever. And we didn't have time to do, you know, sort of the step plans. But those had, the ones that I had prepared for me by Eversheds in several countries were absolutely, you know, magnificent in terms of helping us manage the project, because we didn't have a big project management team. Like Etta said, we were all sort of doing this integration or these integration activities as a second, and in some cases for certain people, third jobs. So to have that all laid out in one place and have everybody have visibility to it was absolutely crucial and invaluable. So that was tremendous.
Yeah, I totally agree. Everything from that original set of minutes, just saying, authorizing, yes, this merger is now going to take place, because the Workers' Council then can hang their hat on it and say, oh, right, I can start my consultation. It's definitely going ahead all the way through. And I think you can't underestimate the post-completion activities. In our world, very often, we then had to dissolve one of the entities that was left if we did a business and asset transfer. Deregistration of a branch office or whatever it may be, again, another set of minutes. And as Eda said, different jurisdictions. Wow, you know, the bureaucracy in, say, France or Spain, where you need a public deed and you need notarized everything. We did something in UAE that then has to go off to an embassy to get stamped, and this, that, and the other. But if that's all documented, it does make our life so much easier. And then if I may, just to build on that, one of the other things which is very useful is having the centralized repository for all of these documents, because you start spinning drafts all over the place, and then eventually, hopefully, they all get signed and you've got your final PDFs. That's fine. They're probably on Dave and my local files, and we try and put them somewhere. We're run over by a bus. Where are they? If they're back in the law firm in their nice central repository with other people that can get them, that's really helpful. I've sometimes gone back into that repository to look for something that I think I've lost or misplaced. So I think that's actually a very useful thing to have as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Dave, what you're talking about is a good example of where having tax and corporate talk to each other, it can be invaluable, because I think sometimes the tax people just put together sort of what I would call the concept steps, and the corporate people have to figure out on their own, okay, how do I actually put together, okay, the minutes and the resolutions, and this has to happen before that. And I think the more tax and corporate can talk to each other, because sometimes tax cares about the details like that, and sometimes they don't. And so I think we can have a useful conversation with each other and hammering out all those details.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I will say, so our tax and legal advisors, again, in the last couple I did were separate, and the tax step plans were more conceptual, like you say, Randy. And then it was sort of left to myself with Eversheds to sort of come up with the implementation step plan, you know, with the tax plan in sort of the background. And then I will say also, and this is not a criticism, but something that I experienced in all of the integrations and restructurings that I've done is that while you're in the midst of them, often the tax planners and advisors come up with, they see opportunities to do additional reorganizations or restructurings that are beneficial, and those get thrown in kind of the middle of your step plan, and then you've got to figure out kind of how and where to fit those in. In fact, that happened to me in this last one, and we ended up doing a complete restructure of our German structure. We ended up with an Organschaft, and you know, we had to sort of take a step back, reassess our step plan, find out where we could fit that in, because David, to your point, there was certain things that the tax advisors wanted done in a specific order on the same day, but in timed. So we had to work that into the whole step plan and things like that. So it is crucial to have them talking to each other, and have those conversations and visibility, because it inevitably comes up in every restructure.
I dislike those changes as well. It's always the tax colleagues.
I'm not personally guilty of that. I've never.
Yeah, yeah, I know. From prior experience, of course.
Yeah. Well, and it brings up an interesting question though about timing. Obviously everyone's conscious of legal fees. That's a big issue. We're all trying to deliver high quality and value to our respective clients for a reasonable amount of cost. And in light of what you were just talking about, Dave, how do you try to navigate when to bring external advisors into the loop? Because if you bring them in too early, it's inefficient. But if you bring them in too late, then you're playing catch up, and you're more likely to end up with last minute changes to the plan.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I think there's no such thing as too early. I would far rather err on that side of it than coming in too late. I have seen both, and you're right, it becomes a bit of a car crash. Everything's very, very rushed and very high paced and stressed out if you leave it to the last minute. So no, I'd rather do it. In fact, I did one where I think we engaged the lawyers about 3 months earlier than they needed to. So there was a little flurry of activity, then we stopped for a bit, and then we picked up again. But it didn't do any harm. And I think just touching on fees, that's one of the other takeaways, is preferably if it's a law firm that you're using regularly, you should be negotiating discount rates, or preferably a cap. If that's not permitted, or the law firm you're working with isn't going to work on that basis, then certainly have some early warning thresholds where they would then advise you and say, right, we're now hitting this threshold, we're now hitting that threshold. So it doesn't come as a big surprise at the end. That's the main point. No one likes the surprise. They could normally, even if you're going over, it can be worked out through good communication. But so I think that's the only thing I'd say on that.
Yeah, I would reiterate and agree completely. I want to say there's almost never too early, like David said. I mean, when we did our first one in 2021 here at Jazz, I think maybe a lot of it was on our part in that we didn't know what we wanted to do after this acquisition until after the acquisition. And so, and Eversheds did the represented us in the acquisition prior to it as well. So I would have liked to have had those discussions, pre-close, but it didn't work out that way. And then our tax advice also came late. I mean, I remember some of the lawyers at Eversheds laughing at us, at me specifically, questioning or telling us that we weren't going to get done on the schedule that we wanted to make work. And it was a bit of a car crash. Ultimately, we somehow pulled it out, got it back on the tracks, and got it done by the date we wanted to, with the exception of one country. But yeah, there's almost never too early, in my opinion.
Well, Randy, I recently, sorry, but
Go ahead.
I recently heard from a colleague basically from a client via the colleague. And the client said, apparently, oh, it's just an internal reorganization. Why do we need even lawyers? That's the complete now polar opposite, whether it should be early or too late. Thinking of the consequences that can actually, like serious consequences, and we've seen it where we unearthed mistakes by the in-house team who wasn't a foreign local counsel. They didn't consult with the local counsel. So they did it from their law perspective. As we said in the beginning, there's so many nuances and things. Documents weren't executed in the proper way. So it means basically null and void. And then how do you treat the tax benefits you obtained already. And let's face it, I think there are more and more revenue services or like that really go that they look more detailed into the folders. They do audits to see if it has been properly implemented, and they become also more coordinated. I was recently contacted, for example, to look at analyzing a structure that was implemented 7 years ago. So to say something is just internal, I think is very, very dangerous. I mean, I would call it gross negligence, but.
Yeah, I can get it was funny after we did one of the acquisition, or the bigger acquisition 2 years ago, our team, our executive team kind of looked at the legal team and said, okay, it's time to do this internal restructuring, go to it, sort of implying that, yeah, we didn't need to hire external advisors for this whole thing. We quickly disabused them of that notion, but that was the default thing, was it's an internal restructure. Why do we need to spend on external advisors? And I agree with you 100%. And there's so many moving parts, and it's so complicated, and throughout the different jurisdictions and the nuances and documents and signatures, and like David was touching on, asset transfers, mergers, or share acquisitions. It's critical to have external advisors for an internal restructure and reorganization. And like I said, I think as early as you can.
Well, and Dave, based on something you said, I'd also like to put in a plug for, I think there's value when it makes sense to have the same tax person involved in the M&A transaction, as well as thinking about the integration you're going to do afterwards while you're working on the acquisition. I've had the chance to do it both ways, and I'd much prefer to be involved in both, because I think it helps, because you can think about the integration while you're doing the M&A transaction, and already planning ahead to smooth the path for that.
Yeah.
I think I thought we will be interrupted by Alan, but I think we reached the full hour, Alan. And
look, I didn't want to interrupt. I think you guys can carry on for a bit. I mean, it's a very good conversation, very insightful. I didn't want to interrupt, but we're talking about costs as well, because I think it's an interesting and important point. But yeah, I haven't received any questions, because I think it was just like very. We had a very good flow. Do you have anything else to add? I mean, we can perhaps take another 5 minutes.
Well, I'll go back to something David mentioned about caps and reorganization transactions. I mean, I think one of the challenges with the cap from an external advisor standpoint is, until you've gotten in and gotten a handle on exactly what you're trying to do and done some of the due diligence to really understand the details, I think it's hard to know whether the cap is something that makes sense. So that's one of the things we struggle with. And the other thing that we sometimes do is try to lay out our fee estimates in phases. But even with the phases, there's pros and cons, because the further out the phases are, the less certainty there is about trying to estimate what the fees look like. And so, but I think what you said is key, which is communication, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it up front. Let's talk about it as we go along, so that everybody can sort of understand where are we and what makes sense, and why are we where we are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, very interesting. Eda, do you want to add something? I think it was quite thorough, very interesting, actually. If not, well, I have to thank everyone for attending. A huge thank you to Evershed Sutherland, to Randy and Eda, obviously, and to Dave and David, to the audience in general. If you have questions at all, I do encourage you to get in touch with Eda and Randy at Evershed Sutherland, and we do hope to see you at another webinar shortly, actually. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
all very
Everybody.
much.
Bye.
Thank you, David.